Stop, the 1952 Sahara discovery that changes everything. Stop, the radio clipped the word in the dark. On a 1952 Sahara line, needles jumped, the pen tore through paper, and the crew froze. Seismic returns looked like open ocean under stone. Night vents blew air that felt wrong, cold, metallic. A magnetometer wandered until the operator slapped it. Then the field chief called it, shut down, pull back, lock the boxes. Files went upstairs, maps were redrawn. Months later, a quiet agreement closed the sky over a rectangle of sand. The Nubian Sandstone Aquifer was real. Oil surveys had hit something else, and one machine, if it was a machine, kept humming. 1952 field panic, what the instruments showed. To understand that order, go back to a wind-scraped ridge in the eastern Sahara. It's late afternoon. A Shell BP joint crew has laid out a seismic refraction line across what the concession map calls stable dunes over Nubian sandstone. They're chasing anticlines for oil, not water. Charges go in shallow boreholes. Cables stretch like black veins. The geophones tick like crickets. Stakes, if the subsurface isn't what the model says, you can lose men and rigs to sudden subsidence. Insurance only tolerates so much unknown pressure before premiums jump and coverage vanishes. The camp cook hears the word blowout and stops laughing. Shot 1. They expect crisp first arrivals, velocities climbing as waves pass from loose alluvium to sandstone to basement. Instead, the first breaks smear. Travel times stretch, curve, then drop fast, as if the wave fell off a shelf into something that swallows energy. The interpreter marks picks, erases them, and starts again. He's trained in 1940s refraction tables. Nothing fits. The inversion tries to solve for velocity and spits out numbers that belong to water, not rock. Ocean-like impedance beneath confining layers. That's not on the scouting brief. The field geophysicist, a man who chews the same pencil until it splinters, radios base. Velocities inconsistent with oil-bearing sandstone. Possible high-pressure confined layer. He wants permission to widen the spread to cross a suspected Paleovalles axis. Headquarters says proceed, but keep to budget. Money, not mystery, is in the loop. They shoot again. Same curve. Then the magnetometer, an old fluxgate that usually hums through heat haze, starts to wobble on one grid square. Magnetic noise clusters in a way that suggests nearby current, not geology. The instrument tech swaps batteries, then the whole unit. The wobble moves with the position, not the tool. He notes drift and circles the coordinate. At dusk, desert temperatures fall. A gully between dunes exhales air that isn't warm. Two laborers joke about ghosts, then go quiet. One says it smells like wet basalt. Another says there's a faint hum if you press your ear to the sand. Field lore forms fast when people are scared. Action tightens. The crew lays a short reflection line to test what refraction is hinting at. In 1952, reflection gear is heavy and temperamental. Still, they get a few gathers. Hyperbolas should reveal nice, predictable layers. Instead, portions of the return are damped, as if a blanket sits over a cavity. The interpreter leans in. Internal multiples decay too quickly. Signal disappears where the model says it should be lively. He sketches concentric shapes, erases them, then draws them again. On the third day, a scout truck noses into an interdune corridor that locals avoid. The compass flutters a little left of north and won't settle. The driver marks it down to the truck, taps the gauge, and keeps going. The radio picks up a low-frequency carrier that rides under voice. No station, just a tone. The operator calls it atmospheric. The tone doesn't change with distance. Impact lands in paperwork. The insurer's man in Cairo gets a cable. Anomalous pressure indicators, potential subsidence, request to suspend blasting near grid R17. He faxes back a promise to review. Then he quietly raises the policy threshold for catastrophic geologic event. Crews hear rumors that if anything collapses, coverage evaporates. Men think about families and get careful. Unknown to the line boss, government geodesy teams have been logging gravity anomalies in the same district. The numbers are small but consistent, density gaps that don't match mapped lithology. Their reports sit in a colonial office, stamped confidential. The oil guys have their own vaults. In this period, refraction, reflection, and borehole logs rarely meet each other outside boardrooms. Silos keep stories from connecting. Meanwhile, a borehole planned as a shallow stratigraphic test hits damp sandstone earlier than expected. The driller doesn't shout "water strike." He calls for a pressure gauge. The head isn't gushing, but there's lift without pumping. Artesian hints in a place the map says closed basin. He photographs the gauge, stows the film, and writes "See me" on the log margin. Later, that film will be misplaced in a merger. The lead geophysicist has a choice: write the truth and risk losing the oil program, or tamp it down, hold the concession, and get time to look again. Contracts mean access. Access means data. He frames his report carefully: anomalous velocity inversions consistent with saturated, confined units. Recommend wider survey before deep drilling. It's a hedge. He hopes it buys days. Complication tightens the loop. The same grid square crashes a generator twice in one evening. An oscilloscope shows a tremor in the power that no one can source. The electrician blames dust. The mechanic cleans contacts, then swears the alternator is fine. The hum in the sand is louder when the wind dies. No one admits to hearing it. Impact ripples outward. Transects are halted on 2 lines. Procurement requests for extra cable get deferred pending reevaluation. A company man arrives and boxes the field notes. Standard archiving, he says. They never come back. Later, independents will shuffle ministries, libraries will lock stacks, and those coordinates will become smudges. To explain why veterans got spooked, you have to pull the camera back 12,000 years. The Sahara wasn't always this. Climate snapped. Lakes swelled, then died. Water moved, then froze underground. The signatures the crew stumbled on had a memory older than maps, and maybe, if the crew's night stories hold, older than geology alone. Younger Dryas and the Green Sahara memory. To understand why veterans got spooked, you have to go back to the hinge in climate. Around 12,800 years ago, the Younger Dryas slammed a brake on warming. In North Africa, that snap didn't just lower temperatures. It rerouted winds, shifted monsoons, and turned thresholds into doors. What was scrub desert in one century became meadow and lake in another. The Sahara wore green like a season. Stakes look simple on paper and brutal on the ground. When rainlines move hundreds of kilometers, rivers either wake or die. People are forced into new math, compress around water or walk toward rumors of it. A tribe that can read a shoreline buys a century. A clan that misreads a dune loses one in a generation. Abrupt climate isn't a graph, it's a border that moves while you sleep. Action is written in stone and sand. Across the Sahara, Paleolakes left rings you can still trace with a finger from orbit. Shorelines curl around basins that are dry now but held waves that broke for centuries. The Great One, what we call Mega-Chad, sprawled like an inland sea. From the Eneti to Tibesti, abandoned deltas and inverted riverbeds march east and west, proof that water once braided through the desert and then buried its own tracks. NASA's orbital eyes caught the ghost rivers. In the 1990s, the spaceborne imaging radar on the shuttle painted the ground with microwaves that slipped through sand. Where the human eye saw a blank dune, SIRC and XSAR drew maps of old drainage, wadis, fans, meanders, inked as if yesterday. That data set didn't just redraw the Sahara, it gave names back to basins that had forgotten theirs. The radar stitched a memory. The Green Sahara wasn't a myth. It was a living system with arteries and a pulse. Impact sits under the dunes now. Those humid periods recharged porous stone, Nubian sandstone that drank when the monsoon pushed north and held when it retreated. Diatom beds, the glass skeletons of lake life, still lie in the dust like spilled sugar. Fossils of fish and hippo, cattle and antelope mark shores that no longer exist. The aquifer's isotopes date to those windows. The water in deep wells whispers a birth date from the African humid period, not from any recent rain. Evidence multiplies when you stare. From satellites, you see dune fields sculpted over buried valleys. Their crests align with winds, but their feet drape over channels that once ran wet. On the ground, you find stone lines that don't make sense until you step back. Cairns that mark springs gone dry. Low walls that slow sheet flow. Slabs that look like art until you realize they catch dew. Memory is practical when survival requires it. Humans didn't just witness this, they organized around it. Nabta Playa out on the Nubian desert floor holds stone circles laid down with an eye for the sky. Alignments line up with solstices and star risings. The site sits on an ancient playa that filled and emptied with the pulse of monsoons. The people who met their herded cattle carved basins and placed markers that said, "Here water returns." Rock art far to the west shows boats rowing across what is now gravel plain. In Tassili and the Tadrart, cattle cults paint a story of steady hands and planned seasons. What nobody knew at the time, what our 1952 crew could feel but not name, was how that memory embeds in stone. When humid centuries ended and the rainline fell south, much of that water went underground. Confined by clay-rich layers, head built quietly. Pressure stayed even as surface rivers flickered out. The Green Sahara didn't die, it hid. Meanwhile, societies adapted in cycles. As the Holocene warmed again, patches of the Sahara breathed, lakes returned, then receded in pulses. People tracked those pulses with movement and with work. Qanat-like galleries, later called Fagara in the Maghreb, would appear much later, but the logic is older. Map gradient, cut just above the water table, bleed pressure carefully. Even if those exact tunnels weren't here yet, the thought pattern was. You can hear it in the placement of camps around Paleo Springs, and in petroglyphs that cluster on spillways of now invisible lakes. Here's the open loop that pulls us forward. If people thrived in a landscape that turned on and off, did some of them learn to flip small switches? Not magic timing, celestial markers to predict monsoon advance, low walls to slow runoff into soak zones, subtle stonework at vent mouths to turn cold night air into condensation. We're not talking about turbines spun by legends. We're talking about thousands of little choices that, taken together, act like a machine. And then the climate swung again. Dry won. The Green Sahara retreated for good. The living network went quiet at the surface and loud below. The aquifer kept its head. The dunes marched over shorelines and sealed them. What our oil crew found in 1952 felt like a voice through sand because, in a way, it was pressure speaking the grammar of an older world. Modern states would stumble onto that grammar by instrument. Datasets would bloom and then close. Because once you grasp what sits under 4 countries, you inherit not just a map, but a governance problem. The next part of the story is how science rediscovers water and power tries to file it away. The Nubian Sandstone Aquifer, scale, pressure, politics. To see what those instruments were feeling, pull the lens wide. Under Egypt's western desert across eastern Libya, through northern Sudan into Chad, lies a stack of porous stones laid down when this land was river plain and shallow sea. That stack is the Nubian Sandstone Aquifer System, multiple layers, not one lake, capped and squeezed so long that water there holds a memory and a push. It is the largest known fossil aquifer on Earth. Vast, but not infinite. Stakes turn real fast when pressure meets a pipe. Confined layers create artesian head, water that wants to rise without pumping once given a path. In some districts, the head is modest, a few meters of lift. In others, it's enough to make a dry well breathe. That head is money, food, power, and trouble all at once, because the water is old. It recharged mostly during African humid period windows, not last season. You can tap it, but it doesn't refill on human timelines. Action runs through measurements. When hydrogeologists sampled deep wells in the 1960s and 1970s, isotopes like carbon-14 and chlorine-36 dated much of the flow to the late Pleistocene and early Holocene. Chemistry matched the story. Low salinity in protected zones, creeping mineral load where flow paths got long or mixed. Pump tests showed respectable transmissivity. These sandstones aren't tight. Heads bled slowly across hundreds of kilometers, proof of a connected system with baffles and windows, not a simple bowl. Meanwhile, states started tracing contours with intent. Egypt mapped head in the western desert oases and eyed insurance against Nile risk. Libya looked south to Kufra and Sarir and saw a lever, freshwater independent of coasts and rivers. Sudan sat over big slices of recharged rock but struggled with lift, logistics, and conflict. Chad held the downstream end of old basins and needed survival, not leverage. 4 flags, 1 stone mattress, and a legacy that predates them all. Impact is easiest to see in Libya because they built a visible bet. Starting in the 1980s, engineers drilled hundreds of deep production wells across Kufra, Sarir, Tazarbo, and Fezzan. They laid more than 4,000 kilometers of large-diameter pipeline north. The great man-made river turned buried head into urban taps and irrigated circles. Whatever you think about the sponsor, the proof was on the surface. Extraction at scale from the Nubian Sandstone Aquifer System works. The cones of depression around fields showed up from space. Constraint follows close behind. Draw hard on fossil water and you lower head. Lower head means pumps, energy, cost, and eventually dry wells. You also risk subsidence where clay's compact and the ground quietly sags. In coastal reaches, pulling too fast invites salinity creep. In desert interiors, mismanaged irrigation salts soils from the top down. The physics don't care about borders or slogans. The meter spins even when the paperwork says sustainable. Quiet shifts tell their own story. In the 1970s and 1980s, some national agencies published detailed hydrogeologic maps. By the 1990s and 2000s, certain layers of data, precise heads, transmissivity mosaics, stress indicators moved behind gates. Procurement lines showed up for regional borehole integrity and hydrostatic monitoring masts, but the output stayed thin. Satellite products talked about land use, not pressure. Academics complained about missing logs. Librarians shrugged and pointed to mergers and reorganizations. Politics wrapped itself around pressure. Water that ignores boundaries forces deals or fights. Egypt needed a hedge in case upstream Nile projects squeezed the flow. Sudan wanted leverage and food security but kept tripping on instability. Libya, under sanctions, treated fresh inland water as sovereignty made concrete. Chad needed any card it could hold. Each actor read the same map and drafted a different story. None could afford a neighbor's surprise tap near a shared window in the confining layers. Proof of leverage is in how carefully words are chosen. Officials talk about development corridors, oasis stabilization, desert greening, and strategic groundwater. They almost never say fossil. Fossil sounds like countdown. Strategic sounds like plan. The choice is deliberate. If the public hears ancient, finite store, they ask hard questions about equity, duration, and who gets to drink last. Meanwhile, engineers keep their language plain. Heads are falling here. Pumping costs rise there. This well's chemistry is drifting. That gallery's screens are clogging with fines. They see the system as a machine you can over-rev. Short-term pressure gains from shutting one field can help lift another. Badly placed high-capacity wells can starve shallow communities. A pipe laid for politics can outcompete a spring that held a village for centuries. What nobody outside a few rooms hears are the new maps. Composite products that blend gravity, magnetics, seismic hints, and sparse wells to forecast pressure corridors. Those maps control tenders and veto them. A dot on that layer can turn a drilling plan into a security file. The language is procedural, moratorium zone, survey deferral, restricted grid. But the meaning is simple. Somebody believes a wrong hole could unlock or unbalance something they can't fix. This was the moment the 1952 fear got a passport. Not because a hum under sand proves a machine, but because a connected, pressurized body under four nations is, in effect, a living system with rules. Break those rules and you pay. Respect them and you might buy decades of margin. Ignore them and you export crisis downwind and downstream. So yes, the Nubian Sandstone Aquifer System is a sea under stone. It carries heads set by rains that last fell hard before our calendars began. It binds neighbors whether they admit it or not. And the politics are baked in. Whoever maps pressure best decides where steel meets sand. The vanishing maps, or where it never will and why. While that pressure story was solidifying underground, something quieter was happening in filing cabinets. After 1952, the paper trail thinned in places where it should have gotten thick. You can feel the fingers that moved through drawers because the gaps line up with value, places where head was high, transmissivity clean, and access simple. Strategic blindness isn't an accident, it's a choice with beneficiaries. Stakes are simple. If you control the map, you control the tap. Miss a contour and you drill a dry hole. Hide a window in the confining layer and you hold leverage over a neighbor who doesn't know it exists. For new states carving ministries out of colonial shells, inheriting partial records meant inheriting someone else's plan. In a region where freshwater is bargaining power, a missing sheet is a weapon. The action looks bureaucratic, but it lands like a boot. In the late 1950s and 1960s, oil consortia consolidated concessions across the Sahara. With mergers came records integration, a phrase that moves boxes from site bungalows to city basements. Archives were triaged, seismic and petrophysics labeled core business, odd anomalies filed under miscellaneous. Then came corporate rebrands, asset swaps, and the slow evaporation of institutional memory. A field notebook that smelled like diesel ended up inside a legal envelope marked privileged. Meanwhile, independence changed letterhead but not the habit of compartments. Colonial survey offices became national geologic institutes. Some staff stayed, others left with what they could carry. In the shuffle, inventories were redone. Sensitive materials, anything that hinted at border-spanning pressure corridors, were lifted into restricted stacks. Researchers found their bibliographies dotted with "on file with the ministry," a phrase that can mean either safe or gone. Impact shows up decades later when you notice which maps survived. Aerial photo mosaics? Many. Surface geology at broad scale? Plenty. But the detailed overlays, the ones that paired gravity lows with shallow artesian shows or annotated seismic with high damping zone, avoid blasting, those went quiet. University libraries that once circulated colonial-era reports now list them as reading room only. In some capitals, the reading room opens 2 days a week, guarded by a man with no keys. The paper trail, when you do catch it, tells on itself. Company annuals in the 1960s celebrate rationalizing archives. Government gazettes from the 1970s announce new hydrogeology series sheets that never number past 5. A National Library catalog lists a 1954 Eastern Desert Geodesy supplement, but the call number yields an empty folder and a shrug. Ask why, and you'll hear about floods, fires, and renovations. All true sometimes. But the pattern clusters around the same rectangles the 1952 cruise circled. Then there are the whispers that live in pilot bars and way station cafes. In the 1960s, pilots ferrying parts to remote strips talk about no-fly rectangles posted with radio silence. You stray near one edge and a voice you don't recognize tells you to turn. Unmarked airstrips appear where maps say Dune Sea. Listening posts sprout from berms in the middle of nothing. The call signs change with decades, but the rectangles don't. Who benefits from thinner maps? Start with the obvious. If cheap freshwater breaks coastal desalination's monopoly, a lot of capital loses its rent. Firms that plan for decades of desal sales prefer a narrative of scarcity with metered relief, not a sudden inland source that undercuts price. Petrostates built on exporting energy don't rush to empower neighbors with water that reduces dependence and changes migration pressure. And any military planner loves a desert with controllable corridors and known blinds. There's a cleaner motive too: liability. If you publish a precise head map and someone drills, unbalances a system, and triggers subsidence or salinity creep, they can point to your sheet in court. If all you release is a broad brush, you can say you cautioned. Restriction is cover. It's also leverage in negotiation. We'll share the good layer when you sign the thing we want. We should be honest, not every gap is a conspiracy. Archives rot from negligence. Budgets get cut. A box of acetate maps stored under a leaky air conditioner turns to paste. A war empties a ministry in an afternoon. A reformer orders digitization, then the vendor folds. But when the same classes of data go dim across borders, years apart in the same pressure corridors, you stop blaming humidity and start asking who said no. Paper leaves fingerprints even when pages vanish. Procurement tells you what someone is building. In the 1980s and 1990s, tenders appear for remote communications masts, regional hydrostatic telemetry, desert perimeter lighting with no public user attached. A mast with no network, telemetry with no published stream. You can smell an invisible program, fence the rectangle, watch it, and make sure nobody else watches closer. This is where Libya's gamble matters. By dragging the Nubian Sandstone Aquifer System into steel, concrete, and international newsprint, the great man-made river turned an argument into a precedent. Extraction at scale left satellite fingerprints nobody could erase. It forced neighbors and vendors to admit, quietly in back rooms, that pressure corridors exist and can be tapped. And it triggered a countermove. If you can't deny, you can delay, deflect, and compartmentalize. Back at the 1952 grid square, the absence is the loudest thing. Field sketches that referenced ring damping and compass drift are referenced in later memos, but the originals sit behind security stamps or not at all. A junior geodesist's gravity notes match a later satellite solution to 4 decimals, but his bound notebook is cataloged as mislaid during reorganization. Even the index cards went missing. Somebody erased in pencil, not ink, quiet enough to be plausible, careful enough to steer steel away. Why? Because a comprehensive public map of pressure and anomalies would turn a rectangular patch of Sahara into a bargaining chip for everyone, not just a few. Cheap inland water would bend migration, soften bread prices, and shift leverage from coasts to oases. That threatens entrenched revenue streams and neat diplomatic hierarchies. So the maps didn't burn, they blurred. And yet the ground remembers. Cones of drawdown, satellite thermal hints, pilots, detours, Tuareg routes that skirt bad ground. All of it traces a pattern that paper tried to hide. The next move in the story is what happens when one country refuses to keep the secret and lays pipe anyway.